raised my sister's abandoned son for 18 years. When our mother died and left him money, the family said I'd stolen him the whole time at the reading of my mother's will, my sister, who I had not seen in 11 years. Who walked in that morning in a good coat like she just stepped out for cigarettes, waited until the solicitor read the provision about the boy, and then she stood up and she pointed at me across the room and she said to everyone, "There." That's why she did it. That's why she took my son and turned him against me and kept me away for 18 years. She was never raising him. She was positioning him. She knew Mom would leave him something, and she made sure she'd be the one holding the strings. Her voice broke beautifully. She stole my child to steal my inheritance, and you all let her. And the room turned to look at me, my aunts, my uncle, my mother's friends, and I saw in their faces that some of them in that instant leaved her because the story was clean and terrible, and it explained why the black sheep of the family had a boy, and I did not. And I understood that I was about to have to prove that the 18 years I had spent raising an abandoned child were not the longest confidence trick in the history of my family. Let me back up. My name is Deborah Nwankwo. I'm 49 years old. 18 years ago, my younger sister left her 3-year-old son in my flat and disappeared, and I raised him. I raised him into a tall, funny, gentle 18-year-old who calls me Mom. And when our mother died and left that boy a substantial inheritance, my sister came back, and the family closed ranks, and together they told a story in which I had not rescued an abandoned child, but stolen one. Kidnapped my own nephew, poisoned him against his real mother. Kept him for 18 years as a long-term investment in an inheritance I always knew was coming. It was the cruelest thing that has ever happened to me, and I have had some cruel things happen to me, and I want to tell you why it was the cruelest before I tell you anything else. Because when someone accuses you of stealing money, they attack your honesty. When someone accuses you of stealing a child, of faking 18 years of love as a scheme, they attack the thing itself. They don't just say you're a thief. They say the love was never real, and the love was the truest thing I have ever done. And the terrible part, the part that nearly destroyed me, is that on paper, on the cold legal paper, the story almost worked. Because I had never formally adopted him. Because the arrangement was informal, a thing of the heart and not the courts. Because I was, in fact, the person positioned to benefit. Every true thing about how I loved him could be redescribed as a step in a plan. It took a social worker's 11-year-old file, and a letter my mother hid, and above all the boy himself, now old enough to speak, to pull the love back out from under the lie. Let me tell you about my sister, because you cannot understand any of this without understanding Yemi. Yemi is 4 years younger than me, and she was the beautiful chaos of our family. Charming, magnetic, impossible, the kind of person who lights up a room and then sets it on fire. She had problems, real ones, that I'm not going to lay out in detail because they're hers, and because this isn't a story about blaming an addict. Addiction is an illness, and I've made my peace with the illness. What I have not made my peace with is what the illness was used to justify, 18 years later, by people who weren't there. Yemi had a son at 24, Emmanuel, and Yemi loved Emmanuel the way she loved everything, enormously, unreliably, in bursts between disappearances. For the first 3 years of Emmanuel's life, I was the backstop. When Yemi vanished, I had him. When Yemi surfaced, she took him back, and I let her, because she was his mother, and I believed every time that this time she'd hold it together. And then one night, Emmanuel was 3, it was February, it was raining. Yemi turned up at my flat at 11 at night with Emmanuel asleep on her shoulder and a bag of his things, and she was in a bad way. And she said she needed me to have him. For a few days, just a few days, I've got to sort myself out. And I took him because I always took him, and I put him in my bed, and I made her a cup of tea, and she drank half of it, and while I was in the kitchen, she left. She left, not for a few days. She left, and she did not come back, and I did not see my sister again for 11 years. I need you to understand what those first weeks were like, because they become the whole legal spine of the case 18 years later. I did everything right. I want that on the record because 18 years later they'd say I engineered it. When Yemi didn't come back after a week, I reported it. I rang the family, I rang around her friends, I contacted the police, I contacted social services. I did not squirrel a child away. I raised the alarm loudly through every official channel because I was terrified and because a 3-year-old needs more than a panking ant. Social services came. There was an assessment, and this is the thing that matters. There's a file. From the very beginning, there is a documented official contemporaneous record that Emmanuel had been left with me, that his mother had abandoned him, and could not be located, that I had come forward, and that I was assessed by professionals. At the time, as a suitable kinship carer. It was all done properly. I became his carer under a recognized informal kinship arrangement, with social services aware and involved, because that is what you do, and I did it. What I did not do, and this is the gap they drive a truck through 18 years later, is formally, legally adopt him. Because for years, adoption felt like a betrayal. Yemi was out there somewhere. She was his mother. To adopt Emmanuel would have been to declare her gone forever, to close a door I kept believing she'd walk back through, and I couldn't do it. And then more years passed, and he was mine in every way that mattered. And the paperwork felt like an insult to a truth that was already total, and I kept not doing it the way you keep not doing the thing that seems unnecessary, because reality has already settled it. That failure to formalize, that act of leaving the door open for my sister, out of love for my sister, became, 18 years later, the evidence that I'd kept him in a deliberately murky status to control him. The kindness was reread as the cover story. Let me tell you about the 18 years, briefly, because the whole point of what they did was to erase them, and I won't let them be erased. I raised him. From 3 to 21, no, he's 18 now, from 3 to 18, I raised Emmanuel as my son because that is what he became. I gave up things. I was 31 and single when Yemi left him with me. I did not have the life I might have had because I had a 3-year-old, and then a schoolboy, and then a teenager, and I built my entire existence around him, the way you build your existence around a child, because he was my child, whatever certificate said. Let me give you a few of the days, because I raised him is 3 words, and they spent 18 years compressing my life into them so they could throw it away. There was the first year when he was 3 and 4. He would wake in the night screaming for his mummy, and I would go in and I would hold him, and I could not say, I'm here. Because I wasn't the one he wanted, so I would just hold him and say, you're safe, you're safe. Over and over, a 31-year-old woman who did no children rocking somebody else's abandoned son at 4 in the morning before a nursing shift at 7. I did that for the better part of 2 years. Nobody helped. Nobody knew. It doesn't go in any file, the number of nights, but I have them counted somewhere in my body. There was the day he started school, and I stood at the gate with the other mothers, and one of them said, kindly, and are you Emmanuel's mom? And I froze because it was the first time anyone had asked, and I didn't have an answer that fit on a school gate. And I said, I'm his family, and she gave me a look I'd get 1,000 more times. A look that files you under complicated. And Emmanuel, 4 years old, turned around and said, she's my Deborah, which was what he called me then, and took my hand and went in. She's my Deborah. It took him until he was about 7 to start calling me Mom, and he did it on his own, one day, out of nowhere, and I had to leave the room so he wouldn't see me cry. There was the eczema and the asthma and the ear infections, and the one terrifying week when he was 6, and had a fever that wouldn't break, and I sat in A&E at 3 in the morning alone, a nurse, who suddenly knew nothing because it was my own child. There was no one to call because the family was asleep, and Yemi was a rumor, and I sat in that plastic chair, and thought if anything happens to this boy, I will not survive it, and understood in that thought that I was not his aunt. Aunts don't think that. I was his mother. It had happened somewhere in the 3 years without my noticing the exact moment, the way it happens to anyone. And there were the questions, starting around 11. Why did my mom leave? Was it because of me? Do you think she thinks about me? And I had made a decision early that I would carry alone for 18 years, and that I would pay for it at the very end. I decided I would never let him hate her. To every question I gave the answer that protected Yemi and cost me. Your mom was very unwell. It was never about you. She loved you. She just couldn't. I built him a mother out of nothing. Out of the woman who'd walked out in the rain. Because a boy needs to believe his mother loved him more than he needs the satisfying simplicity of a villain. I gave Yemi a loving portrait she did nothing to earn, painted daily, for years, in my own hand, to a child. And she came back and used the frame I'd built to hang me. I was there for the asthma and the nightmares and the first day of school and the parents' evenings, where I was sometimes the only brown face and always the one they weren't sure how to address. I was there for the hard years, around 11, 12. When he started asking about his mother, and I had to find a way to tell a child the truth about abandonment, without breaking him, without poisoning him against Yemi, because I made a decision early that I would never make him hate his mother. That I would leave that door open for him even though she'd walked out through it. I told him always, your mum loved you and your mum was very unwell and it wasn't about you. I defended the woman who abandoned him, to the child she abandoned, for 18 years, so that he wouldn't grow up with a hole shaped like hatred. And 18 years later, that same woman stood up in a solicitor's office and said I'd poisoned him against her. I paid for everything, alone. There was no Ashworth fortune here. I'm a nurse, I work shifts, I did it on a nurse's salary, and it was hard, and I did it. The money is not the point of my story, but I want it noted, because they'd claim I did it for money. I spent money, my whole adult-during life on that boy. There was no inheritance in view for the first 15 of those 18 years. My mother was alive and well, and not rich. The idea that I took a 3-year-old in the rain in February 2006 as an investment in a will that didn't exist and wouldn't materialize for 15 years is, when you say it plainly, insane. But they didn't say it plainly. They said it cleverly at the end, when the will suddenly made it sayable. Now let me tell you about the family, because the family is the reason the lie had oxygen. My family did not help me raise Emmanuel. I want to be precise and unbitter about this, but it's the load-bearing fact. For 18 years, I raised that child essentially alone, and the family watched. My mother helped a little in the early years and loved him. That becomes important. But my aunts and my uncle and the wider family treated Emmanuel and me as a slightly awkward situation they were glad wasn't theirs. Deborah's taken on Yemi's boy. Poor Deborah. Wasn't that good of her? And then they went back to their lives, and I went back to raising him, and the wasn't that good of her curdled over years into something I only understood later, into low background resentment that I had done a hard, good thing that made their not doing it visible. Because here is a truth about families and sacrifice. The person who makes the sacrifice becomes an accusation just by existing. Every time the family saw me with Emmanuel, they saw the thing they hadn't done, and people do not forgive you for being the evidence of their own failure. They wait, sometimes for years, for a reason to believe you weren't so good after all, because if you weren't so good, then their not helping wasn't so bad. Let me give you one concrete instance of that resentment, because it explains the speed better than any theory. About 4 years before my mother died, Emmanuel was maybe 13. There was a family gathering, and I was tired, genuinely worn to the bone doing shifts, and raising a teenager alone, and I said something mild to an aunt about how hard it was just venting. The way you do. And this aunt, Auntie Ronk, my mother's sister, looked at me and said with a little smile, well, nobody made you take him, Deborah. You could have let social services do their job. You chose to play the martyr. You can't complain about a cross you picked up yourself. You chose to play the martyr. I remember standing there holding a paper plate, unable to speak, because the cruelty of it was so precise. I had taken in an abandoned 3-year-old rather than let him go into the care system, which, for a black boy in this country, I had reasons to fear, and it had been reframed by a woman who'd done nothing, as a performance I was staging for attention. And underneath it, I could hear the real grievance, the one that would eventually power the whole lie. That my having done a hard good thing was an accusation against everyone who hadn't, and that they resented me for it, and that the resentment had been sitting there for years. Looking for a shape, the will gave it a shape. Suddenly, she chose to play the martyr could become she chose to take the child could become she took the child on purpose for a reason could become she took the child for the money. Each step was tiny. Each step was a slight darkening of a thing they already believed. At the time Yemi walked in at the funeral, the family had 18 years of low resentment preloaded, and all she had to do was hand them a motive, and the whole structure they'd been quietly building for 2 decades snapped into place at once. Yemi's return and the will gave them the reason, and they took it with a speed that told me they'd been wanting it for 18 years. My mother died when Emmanuel was 17. And my mother, who had loved that boy and watched me raise him, did a thing that was meant with total love, and that detonated my life. In her will, she left a substantial sum, most of what she had, around £90,000, in trust for Emmanuel. For my grandson Emmanuel, who was raised with such love. And she named me as the trustee to manage it for him until he was 25. She did it to protect him. She did it to reward the raising. She did it, I think, partly to say, in the only language my undemonstrative mother had, that she'd seen what I'd done. It was the match that lit everything, because now, suddenly, there was money attached to the boy, and I was the one holding it, and 18 years of love could be re-narrated as the long game that led to this room. And that is when Yemi came back. Don't know how she heard, the family I assume. But my sister, who had been a roomer for 11 years, walked into our mother's funeral in a good coat, clean and well and composed, and the family, this is the part I still can't forgive, the family was glad to see her. The prodigal returned. There were tears and embraces. The woman who abandoned a 3-year-old in the rain was welcomed home at the funeral of the mother whose grandchild she dumped, and I stood there with the grandchild, now 17, now taller than both of us. How bewildered, and watched my family fold his abandoner back into its arms. And within days, the story began. The story was this, and I have to hand it to them, it was well made. Yemi had not abandoned Emmanuel. Yemi had been a young mother struggling, and her controlling older sister, me, had taken advantage of a vulnerable moment to take the child. I had in this telling encouraged Yemi to leave, or at least made it easy, and then I had systematically excluded her. Kept her from her son, refused her contact, poisoned Emmanuel against her, and raised him in isolation from his real family. All as part of a long-term plan to make myself indispensable, and ultimately to control the inheritance I always knew our mother would leave him. Every element of it was a true thing turned inside out. I had taken the child because she abandoned him. I had kept her from him because she disappeared for 11 years and never once tried to make contact, but now the absence could be recast as my exclusion. I had raised him in isolation from his real family, because his real family didn't help, but now their absence became my imprisonment of him. I had poisoned him against her, I, who defended her to him for 18 years, but he didn't have a relationship with her, and the reason he didn't could be blamed on me instead of on the 11-year silence. And the will made the motive. That was the keystone. Without the will, the story was just spite. With the will, it had a why. She did it all for the £90,000. The inheritance retroactively supplied a motive for 18 years of love, and a motive is what turns a life into a crime. I got a solicitor, a woman called Ijoma Balgun, and I went in certain that this was absurd, that no one could seriously believe I'd stolen a child, that 18 years of school runs and hospital nights and nurses' salary sacrifice was self-evidently not a heist. And Ijoma gently taught me how exposed I was. She said, "Deborah, I believe you completely, but you need to understand the legal landscape because it is not as safe as your conscience is. Here's the difficulty, you never formally adopted Emmanuel. Legally, you are his aunt and his kinship carer, not his mother. Yemi is his mother that has never been legally severed. She has parental responsibility. You do not in the full legal sense. She let that sit, and now there's the trust. You are the trustee of £90,000 for a boy your sister is claiming you took from her. Do you see the shape? The cold facts, informal arrangement, no adoption, biological mother sidelined, and you controlling the money, a hostile version is available, and your sister is telling it. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it can be argued, and she's arguing it, and some of your family are backing her, and that is dangerous. And then she said the thing that stopped my heart. She said, and Deborah, I have to tell you the worst of it so you're not blindsided. Manuel is 17, nearly 18, so this window is short, but Yemi is his mother with parental responsibility, and if she chose to, she could seek to assert that. The likelihood of a court removing a settled 17-year-old is low, but the threat of it, the threat of a fight over the boy himself, is a weapon she can hold over you. She can make this about custody, not just money. She can make you afraid of losing him. Losing him. That's the moment the false victory turned to ash. I had walked in thinking the worst case was losing £90,000 of my son's money to scheme. And I walked out understanding that the worst case was losing him, that my sister could at the very least threaten to reopen the question of the child himself, and that the fear of that would be used to make me settle to make me hand over the trust. Make me concede the story in exchange for her not fighting for the boy, and she did exactly that. Within a fortnight, the offer came through her new solicitor. Wrapped in the family's blessing, I would step down as trustee and hand the inheritance to Yemi to manage for Emmanuel as his real mother, and I would facilitate reunification and acknowledge that the arrangement had always been informal and temporary, end in return. Yemi would not pursue her parental rights formally or involve the courts in Emmanuel's living situation. They were offering not to fight me for my son if I gave them his money and signed a statement calling 18 years of motherhood a temporary babysitting arrangement. And I nearly did it. I have to tell you that honestly, because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story for anyone who might ever be where I was. I nearly signed. Not because I believed them, because I was afraid. Because the one thing in the world I could not survive was losing Emmanuel, and they had found the exact nerve and put their thumb on it, and I thought, what is 90,000 pounds? What is my reputation? What is the truth even? Against the risk of that boy being dragged into a courtroom of a judge of any chance at all that I lose him, give them the money, sign the lie, keep the child. That's the trade. Take it. I had the statement in front of me. It described me as someone who had provided temporary informal care. I had a pen. I was going to sign away 18 years of being his mother, in writing, to keep him, which is the cruelest trade a person can be offered, because it asks you to destroy the thing in order to keep it. I want to stay in that night for a moment, the night with the pen, because I think it's the truest thing I can offer anyone who finds themselves where I was cornered not by a strong case, but by a strong fear. It wasn't the money that had me reaching for the pen. I want to be clear about that. I would have handed over the 90,000 pounds in a heartbeat. It was never mine, and I'd never wanted it. It was the sentence Ijoma had said, that Yemi could make it about the boy himself, could threaten the courts, could make me afraid of losing him. That fear did something to me that no argument could have. It made me stupid. It made me willing to sign a document I knew was a lie because the lie was small, and the fear was enormous. And when you love a child that much, the arithmetic stops working. You will trade anything, including the truth, including your own dignity. Including 18 years of your own life for even a slightly lower chance of losing him. That's how the threat works. It doesn't have to be real. Ijoma had told me plainly that a court was very unlikely to remove a settled 17-year-old. The actual risk was tiny. But unlikely is not impossible, and a terrified mother cannot tell the difference between a 1% chance and a certainty of losing her child. Both feel like the end of the world at 3 a.m. Yemi and the family didn't need a strong hand. They needed me to imagine, just once, vividly, Emmanuel being taken, and once I'd imagined it, I'd have signed anything to make the image stop. I sat there with the pen and I imagined it, and I started to cry, and I brought the pen down to the line. And I want to be honest, if Emmanuel hadn't walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, I think I might have signed. I was that far gone. The thing that saved me was not my own strength. It was my son walking in and being braver than I was. And I want to tell you the two things that stopped me, because they are the whole third act. ACT 3, the file, the letter, and the boy. The first was a phone call from a woman I had not spoken to in over a decade. Her name was Susan Okafor, and she had been the social worker assigned to Emmanuel's case 18 years ago when Yemi vanished and I came forward. She was retired now. And she rang me. A cousin of mine had mentioned the situation to a friend, and it had wound its way to Susan, the way things do, and she said, "Deborah. It is Deborah, isn't it? I don't know if you remember me. I was the social worker." February 2006, the little boy left in the rain. She paused. "I have never forgotten that case, and I have just heard what your sister is claiming, and I am telling you now, over my dead body." Susan remembered. More than remembered, Susan knew that there was a file. An official, contemporaneous professional record from 2006 and the years after that told the true story, and the one voice a court cannot dismiss. The voice of a neutral professional writing at the time, with no stake, no love, no motive. And that file said everything. It recorded that Emmanuel had been abandoned by his mother, who could not be located. It recorded that I had come forward and raised the alarm, that I had contacted them, not hidden him. It recorded the assessment that found me a suitable kinship carer. Recorded in the years that followed that the mother remained absent, that no contact was made by her, that the placement with me was stable and loving and in the child's best interests. Susan's own notes from the time, in her own professional hand, described a 3-year-old thriving in the care of an aunt who had stepped up when his mother walked out. 18 years later, my sister was claiming I'd stolen the child and excluded her. And there was a social services file, written by a neutral professional in real time, that said, the mother abandoned him, the aunt came forward, the aunt was assessed and approved, the mother never returned. The truth had been written down by someone with no reason to lie, at the exact moment it happened, and had been sitting in an archive for 18 years waiting for the day someone tried to reverse it. The second thing was my mother's letter. Because my mother, it turned out, had not only left Emmanuel money, my mother had known her family. My mother had watched the dynamics for 18 years, had seen the family's low resentment of me, had known what Yemi was, had understood, I think, exactly what might happen if she left that boy money and then died. And my mother, undemonstrative, careful, had done something about it. I found it when I finally forced myself to properly clear her things, an envelope in her Bible, addressed to me, that she must have written in her last year, and it was not a legal document. But it was, a solicitor would later tell me, powerful evidence of exactly the facts that were in dispute. It said, "Deborah, I'm leaving Emmanuel the money because you gave him a life, and I want him to have a start. And I'm making you the trustee because you are the only person I would trust with a penny of it or a hair of that child's head. I know what this family is. I know they said wasn't that good of her, and then did nothing for 18 years. And I know your sister, God help me. I know my own daughter, and if she ever comes back, it will be because she smells money, not because she smells her son. So let me write down what I saw with my own eyes, in case it's ever needed. Yemi left that boy with you and vanished. You did not take him. She left him. You raised him alone on nothing, and you never once let him hate his mother, which is more grace than she deserved and more than I could have managed. If anyone ever tries to say you stole that child, this is his grandmother telling you the truth from the grave. You didn't steal him. You saved him, and I saw it all. Mum, you didn't steal him. You saved him, and I saw it all. My mother had written a witness statement from beyond her own death, because she knew her family and she knew her daughters, and she had loved me enough in the end in her cautious way to leave me the one weapon that mattered, an eyewitness account. From the family's own matriarch date in her own hand, saying exactly what had happened. And the third thing, the thing that was not evidence but was everything, was Emmanuel himself, because in all of this, all the legal maneuvering, and the family's story and my own terror, there was a person who had been 3 years old in the rain, and was now 17, nearly 18, and who had a voice. And who had been watching the adults fight over him as though he were a parcel. And one evening, while I sat at the kitchen table with the statement I was about to sign, the one that called me his temporary carer, Emmanuel came in. And he read the room because he has always read me like a book, and he said, "What is that?" And I tried to protect him, the way I always had. I said it was nothing, grown-up things, don't worry. And my son, 17 years old, 6'2", the 3-year-old I'd carried to bed grown into a man, sat down across from me and said, "Mum, stop. I know what they're saying. I'm not a kid. I've heard all of it. Aunt Yemi's telling everyone you stole me and kept me from her and did it for Grandma's money." He looked at me. "And you're sitting here about to sign something, aren't you? Because you're scared. Because they've made you scared they'll take me away." His voice shook. "You're about to sign a paper that says you're not really my mum to keep me, aren't you?" I couldn't speak, and Emmanuel said, "Well, I'm 18 in 5 weeks, and then nobody gets to decide anything about me except me, so I need you to not sign that. Because I'm not a piece of Grandma's money, and I'm not Aunt Yemi's to come back and collect. I know exactly who raised me. I was there for all of it, and I'm going to tell everyone because I'm the only one who actually gets to say." The reckoning came at the reading of the will, the moment I described at the start, my sister on her feet, pointing. "She stole my child to steal my inheritance, and you all let her." And the room turned to me, and some of them believed her. And I stood up, and for the first time in 18 years I did not defend Yemi, and I did not soften it, and I did not manage everyone's feelings. I laid it down. I said, "There's a social services file, from 2006. Written by the social worker assigned when Yemi left Emmanuel with me and disappeared. Her name is Susan Ackefer. She's retired, and she's willing to come and tell you all herself. That file says, in a neutral professional's contemporaneous handwriting, that Emmanuel was abandoned by his mother, who could not be located, that I came forward and raised the alarm, that I was assessed and approved as his carer, and that his mother never returned. It's dated 2006, Yemi. 18 years before you needed a different story. Yemi said something, she's twisting it, she was manipulated, but I kept going. And there's this. I put my mother's letter on the table. Mum wrote it in her last year. She left it in her Bible. She knew exactly what would happen when she died, because she knew this family and she knew her own daughters. I'm going to read you what your matriarch wrote about who raised that boy. And I read it. I read you didn't steal him, you saved him. I saw it all in my dead mother's words in that room, and I watched the faces of the aunts and the uncle who'd been ready to believe Yemi change. Because it is one thing to accept a convenient story from a returned prodigal, and quite another to hear the dead grandmother call it a lie from her own grave. Yemi said, "She was old, she was confused." Deborah got to her. And that was when the door opened, because I'd asked him to wait outside until I called, and Emmanuel came in. He stood at the head of the room, this tall, gentle boy, and he was shaking, and he said, "Can I say something? Since everyone's talking about me like I'm not a person." Nobody stopped him, and he said, "I'm 18 next month, and I've listened to all of you decide who I belong to, and I want to say it once so everyone hears it." He looked at Yemi, not with hatred. I made sure of that. 18 years of making sure of that. He looked at her almost gently. "You're my mother, I know that. Deborah always told me that always, even when I was angry, she never once let me hate you. She defended you to me my whole life." His voice cracked. "But you left." "I don't remember it, I was 3, but I know it, because there's a file and there's Grandma's letter, and because you weren't there. For 18 years you weren't there, and she was there for every single day. Everyone. When I had asthma at 3 in the morning, it was her. When I got suspended, it was her. When I cried about you, it was her, holding me, telling me you loved me." He turned to the room. "So you can say she stole me. But I'm the one who got raised. I'm the actual person it happened to. And I'm telling you, nobody stole me. Somebody kept me when the person who was supposed to didn't. And now that there's 90 grand, everyone's suddenly very interested in who my real family is." He looked at Yemi one more time. "You came back for Grandma's money. She came and got me in the rain when I was 3, and there wasn't any money, and there was never going to be any money. That's the difference. That's the whole difference. And I'm 18 in 5 weeks, and I already know exactly who my mum is, and it's not going to change no matter what any of you sign." And he came and stood next to me. And he took my hand, 6'2", holding his mum's hand in a room full of people who tried to take him, and it was over. Not legally, not yet, but really, in the way that mattered, it was over, because the one witness none of them had thought to consult had grown up and walked in and told the truth. Legally, it collapsed for them completely and fast. You cannot sustain a claim that a child was stolen when there is a contemporaneous social services file documenting the abandonment and the kinship assessment. You cannot claim exclusion when the mother's own 11-year silence is a matter of record and no contact was ever attempted. My mother's letter. Susan's file and willingness to testify 18 years of school and medical and financial records, all in my name and my hand, and above all a settled, articulate, nearly adult young man who was unequivocal about his own life. It was not a close case. Once the evidence was on the table, it only ever looked winnable in the vacuum the family created by pretending the first 11 years hadn't happened. Yemi withdrew her claims. There was never any real custody threat once Emmanuel turned 18 weeks later. That entire weapon had a 5-week fuse, and everyone knew it, which is why they'd moved so fast and pushed so hard for me to sign before his birthday. Trust stayed as my mother designed it, managed by me for him until he's 25. He'll get his grandmother's 90,000 pounds from the grandmother who loved him, exactly as she intended, and not one penny of it will pass through the hands of the woman who came back for it. I want to be careful about Yemi, because she is my sister, and she is ill, and I have spent 18 years refusing to let a child hate her, and I'm not going to start hating her myself now. I want to think that some tangled part of her even believed her own story, that addiction and shame and 11 years of avoided grief had rewritten her own memory into one where she was wronged rather than wrong. People do that. It's easier to be robbed than to be the one who left. But belief doesn't make it true, and her kneeing the story doesn't mean I had to be destroyed by it. We do not speak. I've made my peace with the illness. I have not made my peace with the aunts and uncle who were so eager to believe the worst of me, because they weren't ill. They were just resentful, for 18 years, of the good thing I'd done, and they took the first chance to call it bad. Susan Okafor came to Emmanuel's 18th birthday. I invited her. She'd only met him as a 3-year-old in a case file, and she stood in my kitchen and watched him tower over the cake, and she cried, and she said, "In 30 years of this work, you rarely get to see how it comes out. Usually you file the report and you never know." She wiped her eyes. I knew. When I wrote those notes in 2006, I wrote them properly, carefully, the way you're supposed to, because you're taught that one day the file might be the only thing standing between a child and a lie. And I always thought that meant protecting the child from bad carers. She looked at Emmanuel laughing with his friends. I never thought once that the file would end up protecting a good carer from the child's own family, but that's what it did. The record doesn't care who it protects. It just holds what was true. The record just holds what was true. Emmanuel is at university now. He's going to be a teacher, which he says is because someone once explained to me that the whole point of writing things down is so the truth survives the people who want to change it. Which is a thing I apparently said to him once and don't remember, and which he has decided is his life philosophy, and which makes me prouder than I can say. He calls me every Sunday. He calls me Mom. He has never once, in the year since all this, expressed a single doubt about who I am to him, and the surety of an 18-year-old is a bedrock thing, and I stand on it. Here's the last thing. I tried to take the purest thing I ever did, 18 years of raising an abandoned child on a nurse's salary alone out of love, and turn it into the ugliest of kidnapping for profit, and for a few terrible weeks they nearly did it. Because on the cold paper the love looked like a scheme, and I had out of love left the door open for exactly the woman who walked back through it to burn me. But love, it turns out, is not as undocumented as I feared. I thought it kept no records. I was wrong. A social worker kept records because it was her job and she did it well. My mother kept a record in her Bible because she saw everything and loved me enough to write it down. And the child himself was a record, a living, walking, 18-year-long record who grew up and got a voice and used it, and no story survives the testimony of the person it was told about. My sister said I stole her son. Her son stood up in a room full of people and said, "Nobody stole me. Somebody kept me. He was 3 years old, asleep on my shoulder when she left him in the rain and walked out of my kitchen. He's 6'2", and he calls me Mum, and he held my hand in front of the family that tried to take him, and he is, and has been since February 2006, and will be until I die, my son. Not on the certificate. I never did get the certificate. I left the door open too long, out of love, and it nearly cost me everything. But in the file, and in my mother's Bible, and in the boy's own voice, and in the 18 years themselves, in every place that actually holds the truth, he was always only mine. I didn't steal him. I kept him. Ask him. He's the only one who was there for all of it, and he'll tell you exactly who his mother is."